Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar about the TN visa. My name is Hugues Plessis. I'm an attorney with Scott Legal PC, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Senior Associate Dustin Saldarriaga. Today we're going to go over the TN visa, which is based on a treaty between the US, Canada, and Mexico, which was previously called the NAFTA, now USMCA. The TN visa is really a great option for citizens of Mexico or Canada who want to come to the US to work for a US employer. Today we will go over the requirements for the visa, the strategy behind a strong visa application, and we will go over the frequent questions that we receive on that specific classification, including the title of today's presentation, whether or not the TN visa requires sponsorship. A few items before we start the presentation that I wanted to go over. First, this webinar is part of a series of webinars that we are doing every week on US immigration topics. This webinar is also being recorded, and we post our webinars on our YouTube channel together with short form content as well. And I would recommend checking those out. Last thing that I wanted to mention is that we also have a blog on our website, and that's an excellent source of information. I think Dustin has some issues, and we'll reconnect shortly. So I'm just gonna share the presentation with you whilst we correct that. So let me just do that right now. There we go. All right, so that should be it. There we go. Should be able to see it now. So yeah, as I was saying, I will go over that with you today, the presentation about the TN, and you will be able to get the recording. And I was also mentioning that you have some information about the TN on our website as well. We have a blog with a lot of really, excellent resource about US immigration. First item that we're going to go through today is about the requirements themselves for the TN visa. So how someone could qualify for the TN visa. You will see that on that slide, there are actually the requirements, and I will go through them with you. So as I was mentioning before, to qualify for a TN visa, sort of the baseline and the first thing that you must be sure of is that you're either a citizen of Canada or Mexico. So if you don't have a passport from Canada or Mexico, the TN visa will not be an option. So that's sort of the first step to go through. Second step here, really important step as well. You must confirm that the profession must be one that's listed in the TN regulations. So what I mean by that is that the position you are being offered by a US employer and for which you actually are traveling to the US and applying for the TN, you must make sure that this position in the US is actually one of the professions that are listed in the TN regulations. So what I would recommend you to do, and you can do it right now after the presentation, is you go onto Google and you check the list of professions for the TN visa. The list of professions is actually in the regulations themselves. So you can just type, TN regulations, list of professions, and you will see a few websites providing the list of all the occupations that are listed in the treaty. So you need to make sure that the position for which you're going to the US for that US employer is one of the professions listed in the regulations. And I will go over that a little bit later on, because the job offer that you will get from the employer in the US might not list the actual occupation that's in the regulations. Maybe the job title in the US is a little bit different than what's listed in the regulations. So just to give you an idea of what types of professions are on there, you have accountant, architect, graphic designers, engineers, computer systems analysts. You also have lawyers. So there's a few occupations, but not all professions are listed. So that's the second step, is to check the regulations and make sure that the profession is actually in there. And then you will see when you check the regulations for the list of professions that with each profession listed, there's actually the required qualifications for it directly in the regulations. So you must make sure that you have the required qualifications for that specific profession. that could be education and or experience. So for example, for engineer, it would be having a bachelor's degree or a state or provincial license. Some professions actually require either education or experience. That's the case for management consultants, for example. You'll see that in the regulations, it says that you can have a bachelor's degree or 5 years of experience. Some professions actually require both. Graphic designers, for example, you need a bachelor's degree and 3 years of experience. So, when you are checking the regulations, you see the profession that matches the profession in the US that you're going to be working for the employer for, and then you check the required qualifications just to make sure that you have those specific qualifications. And regarding qualifications as well, what the employer in the US is requiring is not really relevant for that purpose. You need to have, regardless of what the requirements are for the profession in the US set by the employer, you need to have at least the qualifications that are listed in the regulations for the specific TN profession. And then next bullet point here, and that's something I touched on already, is that you must have a pre-arranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the US. That usually is satisfied through getting a TN letter from the employer, a job offer letter essentially, listing the job title, job duties in the US, duration of the assignment in the US as well, which cannot exceed 3 years, for a TN, and I will go over that a little bit later on. And then those letters usually also include some information about the company and what they do, and also salary or distribution for the profit position. So that's really important to get that. Quick note on the letter as well. We usually recommend for the letter to be signed in wet ink. So bring the original signatures with you when you apply for the TN. That's really important. We've seen issues before with scanned signatures. So quick note on that. And then the last bullet point here, and something I sort of touched on throughout the first slide, is that the job that you're being offered by the US employer must be aligned or consistent with one of the listed professions in the regulations. So essentially the analysis that you have to do is when you get an offer from a US employer and you're thinking about getting a TN visa, you need to look at the job that you've been offered, and especially the day-to-day tasks and duties. And you need to make sure that those duties are actually duties that are aligned with the duties of one of the professions in the regulations. For example, if you're offered a job as a marketer, so in marketing in the US, there's actually no, marketing specific profession listed in the regulations. However, depending on what you will actually do on a day-to-day basis, you might qualify for a management consultant TN, for example. If you advise clients on their marketing, then maybe you could actually argue that this is a management consultant position. So that's something that needs to be done when the profession is not clear-cut. For example, if you are offered a position as a lawyer in the US and it is actually like an attorney position at a law firm, then it is pretty straightforward. Usually that profession is listed in the TN. If the duties of the US lawyer position are just like regular lawyer duties, then the TN should be a pretty straightforward process. However, if the job title of the position in the US is not exactly what's listed in the regulations, then you will have to go through the day-to-day duties of the position in the US and make sure that they actually align with duties of one of the professions in the regulations. And to do that, you need to understand what the government will look at when they are going to perform that review as well of the day-to-day duties to match the two positions. And what the government is doing and what Customs and Border Protection or the consular officer will review will be available resources online about job duties of specific positions. And usually what the government would use will be the Occupational Outlook Handbook, the OOH. That's sort of the main resource for them. And it's publicly available. You can check it as well online. You just type OOH and then the profession you're in, and you will see that it lists all the duties of that position, the requirements to get in as well, has a lot of really useful information about, specific requirements for the position, degrees, fields of the degrees, etc. So if you are applying for a graphic designer position, for example, you can go onto the OOH, type graphic designer, and then you will see there is a tab specifically about the day-to-day duties of graphic designers in the US. And then if the position that you're being offered in the US does not bear that title, specifically graphic designer, but it is close, then you can go through the duties of the position you're being offered, check the OOH for graphic designers, and see if the duties that you're going to be performing in the US actually align with the duties in the OOH. One thing that I want to mention here is that those duties do not have to be the exact same. Actually, it would be a red flag if in the TN letter you just list the exact duties as they are listed in the OOH. Usually CBP and consular officers would not like that. So they have to be similar. They can be a little bit different, depending on what you're actually going to be doing on the day-to-day basis. And also usually duties listed in the OOH are pretty general. So that's something to think about. But that's essentially how you determine whether or not you qualify for a TN visa. You go through the list of the requirements there, whether or not you have a passport from Mexico or Canada, whether the profession that you're going to be working in the US is one of the professions in the TN, either because it is clear-cut or because you've done that review of the day-to-day duties and you've matched that with a specific position, the profession in the TN based on the OOH. And then you need to make sure that you have the required qualifications as per the regulations, that you have the correct degree or the experience or the combination of both, and that you're carrying that letter with you to apply. So next here, I'm going to go over what actually is sponsorship, because that is something that we get a lot from clients, whether or not the TN visa requires sponsorship from the US employer. And to answer that question, I'm going to go over sort of the differences between visa classifications, because I think it's easier to understand it that way. So when we say sponsorship in US immigration, it's actually a very specific notion that usually applies in the context of an H-1B, maybe an L, or employment-based green card cases. When we say that there is sponsorship required by the US employer, we usually mean that the employer has very specific responsibilities towards that that employee in the US. For example, in the context of an H-1B, that means that the employer has to file specific forms with the US Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. And the employer must also make sure that the employee in the US receive a prevailing wage in the specific geographical area that employee will be working in. So they need to file a labor condition application, an LCA, with the Department of Labor and getting certified before filing the H-1B. So that there are some requirements and some responsibility regarding the salary of the employee. And then there is also the responsibilities of the employer when the employee is actually working for them. For example, they cannot be put on leave because that could impact the H-1B. And also when the H-1B has lapsed, then the employer has some responsibilities about making sure that the employee can go back to their home country, for example, paying for travel costs. So, all of those responsibilities that sort of lead to that sponsorship notion, and that's not present for the TN visa. As you can see here in the slide, there's no requirement of filing forms with USCIS unless you're doing a change or an extension of status from within the US, and we'll go over that. But if you apply from outside the US as a Canadian citizen at a port of entry or as a Mexican citizen at a US consulate, you will not have to file any form with the US government. And there are also no requirements regarding required or prevailing wage for TN visas. And then there are actually also no requirements about the location where you will be working. You can apply for a TN, and if you're approved, you can work anywhere in the US. It's not location specific. That's very different from the H-1B because of that prevailing wage calculation and the fact that it's actually very specific based on the geographical location where the employee will work. So very different, responsibilities for the employer in the case of an H-1B or a TN. About the wage, just a quick note on that. It is true that there is actually no required wage for a TN, no prevailing wage. However, some officers, Customs and Border Protection officers for Canadian citizens or consular officers at a US consulate for Mexican citizens may actually take a look at the salary that's proposed and offered. And depending on whether or not that's too low for the area where the TN worker will be located, that could be, source of questioning. It's not going to be a reason for denial usually, but that can come up during the interview process. I see that you're going to work in New York. Your salary seems a little bit low compared to other workers in the same profession in that location and the area. Can you please explain, that sort of thing. And then, as I was mentioning before, compared to other classifications that require sponsorship, like the H-1B, for example, the filing process for TN is very different. For an H-1B, you file with USCIS, you file with the forms, you have the fees associated with that, etc. For a TN, it's very different. You either apply at a port of entry for Canadian citizens, or you apply at a US consulate for Mexican citizens. So the way it works for Canadian citizens, pretty straightforward. You can apply for the TN visa directly at a port of entry. Port of entry here means either an airport in Canada or outside of Canada that has Customs and Border Protection pre-clearance. There are a few airports around the world with CBP pre-clearance, and most of the airports in Canada also have that. If you've traveled to Canada before and then re-enter the US, you would have seen that you are actually going through Customs and Border Protection and seeking admission to the US directly at the airport, in Toronto, Pearson, for example, or in Montreal. So you go through Customs and Border Protection there, and that's also where you're going to apply for your TN. You go to the booth, you get into secondary inspection, and then the CBP officer in the airport will actually review the entire TN application and then, adjudicate it there. Port of entry can also mean land border crossing. You have a lot of land border crossings, on the border between the US and Canada, Buffalo, Rainbow Bridge, a lot of them, and you can apply there. Sometimes you have to have an appointment. Sometimes you can just go there and apply directly. You can also, if you're a Canadian citizen, you can also apply with USCIS first before going to the port of entry. We see that in very risky TN cases for management consultants, for example, or economists. Sometimes the strategy is to apply with USCIS first, file the forms and the fees, get an approval notice from USCIS, and then traveling with that, seeing if that would help getting the TN visa at the border with Customs and Border Protection, because they usually defer to USCIS when there's an approval notice. It's not a sure thing, but could be actually a good strategy decision. And then for Mexican citizens, completely different process. You cannot apply at the land border or at an airport. If you're a Mexican citizen, you will have to go to a US consulate to apply for a physical visa. And that's the crux of the issue here, is that Canadian citizens are actually visa exempt for most classifications. That means that they do not need a physical visa in their passports. There are some exceptions to that, immigrant visas, some family-based classifications as well. And in US business immigration sphere, you have the E2. So if you're applying for an E2 and you're a Canadian citizen, you have to go to the consulate. However, if you're a Mexican citizen, you're not visa exempt for the TN. So that means that you are going to have to apply at a US consulate. That means filing a DS-160 application online, paying the MRV visa fees, and then appear for an in-person interview at one of the 3 US consulates that are actually processing TN visas in Mexico. In Mexico City, and then a couple of others. So you have to go through that process, get the interview done, get the visa file in your passport. And that's sometimes it's a little bit confusing there because the visa that you will get as a Mexican national applying for TN can either be valid for 1 year or 3 or 4 years. So the visa itself is either valid for 1 year or 4 years, depending on the reciprocity fee that you're paying the day of the appointment. You can choose between 2 fees. There is a less expensive fee giving you, a 1-year visa, or you can pay the higher fee to get a 4-year visa. However, that will not impact the duration of stay in the US. And I think that's what's confusing here. The duration of a TN in the US, the time you're allowed to stay and work in the US as a TN visa holder is always going to be 3 years. That's for both Canadians and Mexicans. You get the same duration of stay in the US. Canadian citizens don't get visas, so there is no confusion about that. You just get a stamp in your passport, essentially as a Canadian citizen, and then it will say, usually the employer name and then the duration, so 3 years. But then for Mexican nationals applying at a US consulate, they get visas that are of different length and that usually don't match the duration of stay in the US. So we get a lot of questions about that. If you have a TN visa that's valid for 4 years, you're still only allowed to stay in the US for 3 years at a time. So that means that, if you are at the end of the 3-year period in the US, you will have to exit the US or extend from within the US or change status. But if you're no longer on TN status, you will have to exit, even if the visa is still valid. That does not bear any, impact or consequences on your actual stay in the US. The stay in the US is governed by another document, which is the I-94, that's issued by Customs and Border Protection. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but that's essentially the difference. And another thing about visas as well, quick note for Canadian citizens, if your spouse is not a Canadian citizen, they will actually have to apply at a US consulate to get a TN visa dependent, which is called the TD. So if they're not Canadian citizens, they have to go to the consulate to get that. If they are Canadian citizens themselves, they can apply together with you at the border and get the TD status there. So that's the main difference for Canadians and Mexicans applying for TNs. Either you go to the border as a Canadian or you go to the consulate. And then both can also apply with USCIS if you're already in status in the US to extend your stay, to change status for, if you're an F1 student, for example, you want to change status. In some cases you can, and you will just apply directly from within the US without having to travel. You apply with USCIS, you pay the fees, and then hopefully you get approved that way. So that was it in terms of the difference. And then, as I was saying, finding the TN from the US, that's for everyone. And then digging a little bit deeper into the differences for Canadians and Mexican nationals, because we get a lot of questions about that as well. As I was saying, Canadian nationals can apply at the port of entry. You get interviewed at the port of entry as well. It sometimes is a little bit stressful as well. It's not because you're applying at a port of entry that it's very straightforward. It depends on the port of entry. It depends on the Customs and Border Protection officer as well. It takes time usually. So we would recommend to come in well in advance of your flight if you're flying, for example, because TN applications are actually not a priority for Customs and Border Protection. So you might have to wait for 2 to 3 hours, 4 hours in some cases to get interviewed. And then you provide the application package, they review it, they interview you. At some airports, they also ask you to fill up some forms about the position, and then you pay the fee, the $50, and then you get a visa, a stamp in your passport, and you're good to go for 3 years. As I was saying, if your spouse is not a Canadian citizen, then they will have to apply at the consulate. I mean, technically, as a Canadian citizen, you can also apply at the consulate for TN if you want to. I've seen that happening for very risky cases or cases with some US immigration or criminal background issues, for example, you might want to go to the consulate to get vetted first and get an actual visa stamp. So that it is possible, but we usually don't recommend it if you don't have to, because you have to pay a fee at the consulate as well. That's higher than applying at the port of entry. So that's it for Canadian citizens, pretty straightforward. You get a stamp, as I was saying, with a duration of stay at 3 years. CBP is actually phasing out ink stamps in passports, but they usually do it for the first TN application, and then maybe subsequent travels you will not get stamped, but everything will be on that I-94, the document I was mentioning before. So that's available online, and you can check whether or not the TN was properly approved for the duration of stay. Mexican nationals, very different process, as I was saying, apply at a US consulate in Mexico, one of the 3 consulates that are processing TN visas. There's actually a higher scrutiny for TN visas in Mexico, and that's the reason for that is that the Department of State is currently reviewing and processing some cases that are the result of fraud in the US, and I think it was in most recent cases were in Florida. Essentially, some US employers were offering Mexican nationals to come to the US on a TN visa for usually engineering related positions. So they would apply for TN engineers. And then once they get to the US, they would actually not work as engineers. They would work on the factory floor and not perform the duties of an engineer as per the OH, as I was mentioning before. And so the Department of State has increased scrutiny on TN visa applications for Mexican nationals in specific classification or for specific professions like engineers, for example. So it is pretty challenging at the moment to get a TN visa in Mexico, depending on the position and the background of the applicant. You might get questioned. The case might go through administrative processing for further review. We've seen denials as well, so pretty challenging for some professions. And then as I was saying before, there is also that confusion about the validity of the visa stamp itself, either 1 year or 4 years. Regardless, you will be given only 3 years in the US as an authorized period of stay by Customs and Border Protection. In some cases, if you're renewing the TN from outside the US and not with USCIS, you can actually mail your application to the US consulate in Mexico, and they will not ask you to come for an in-person interview. So that's the interview waiver program. It's been expanded recently after the COVID-19 pandemic. And so if you qualify for an interview waiver, you have to mail your passport and all the documentation to the US consulate. They will review everything. They will stamp the visa and the passport, and then they will give the passport back. You don't have to appear for an in-person interview. Whether or not you qualify for an interview waiver depends on the facts of the case, and you will only know whether or not you qualify once you've started the process. You've paid the fees, you are on that profile on the appointment booking website. The system will let you know whether or not you qualify for an interview waiver. If you qualify for an interview waiver, that's great. You don't have to go to the consulate. However, consular officers can always ask applicants to come in for an interview. If they have further questioning that needs to be done, they have some confusion that needs to be cleared, then they can always ask you to come in, even if you've been granted a waiver at first. Processing times, they usually are very similar. If you're, it's a little bit quicker if you are allowed to go through the interview waiver process, because you don't have to schedule an appointment. As I was saying, US consulates in Mexico are pretty backlogged because only 3 are processing TN visas. So you might not be able to get a visa appointment, right away. So if you are qualifying for the waiver, it's usually a quicker process that way. I think that was it in terms of information that I wanted to provide about differences between applying as a Canadian citizen or a Mexican citizen. And now I will turn it over to Dustin to go over some difficulty and categories and the rest of the presentation.
Great, thank you, Hugues. So I'm having some mic issues, so if those kick in, feel free to send a message in through the chat. I do have that open on my screen, but hopefully Hopefully I won't have any problems with it. So Hugh, great information. We're going to build off of what Hugh shared with us to talk about two particularly challenging TN categories, those being management consultant and economist. And these are challenging for different reasons. The management consultant category is challenging because it is one of the very few TN occupational categories that does not require a degree. You can qualify as a TN management consultant based on experience alone. So for applicants who do not have a college degree, they really are limited to only one or two categories, the management consulting category being one of them, even if they otherwise don't fit as a management consultant, meaning that they're not actually coming to the US to perform the job duties of a management consultant. So the US government knows that this occupational category does act as kind of a catch-all for anyone who doesn't have a degree, and so they scrutinize it. Now, two quick points. The first, what do I mean by experience? What the regulation says is that if you are not qualifying as a management consultant through a degree, which you can, if you have a degree, say you have a master's of business administration, or you have an undergraduate business degree, you may qualify as a management consultant based on your degree. However, if you don't have a degree and you're qualifying based on experience, that needs to be 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. Now, I like to use an example to think about what that 5 years of experience in a field of specialty really looks like. And the example I like to use is that of someone who is an expert in manufacturing and designing solar panels. Let's say we have a national of Canada who has, for the last 10 years, become an expert in designing solar panels, helping with the manufacturing process. And there is a solar panel company in the United States that needs assistance with its manufacturing process. So that US-based solar panel company could provide an offer of employment to this individual who's an expert in solar panels. And if that individual is coming in to help the company address a specific challenge, as a management consultant may, then they could qualify for the management consulting category. And the 5 years of experience in the field of specialty would be the argument that this person has over 5 years of experience, 10 years of experience in solar panels and in the solar panel manufacturing process. So I like that example because it's very clear that this is not a person who has 5 years of experience as a management consultant. They have 5 years of experience in solar panels. So that is clearly related to the consulting agreement, since they're coming to the US to help a solar panel company with the manufacturing of its solar panels. So that's the kind of experience that could qualify you as a management consultant. The other very important thing I want to talk about here is that not all management consultant TN applications are inherently risky or challenging. There really is a spectrum. So the management consultant applications that are less risky are those where you are coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm. So if you're coming here to work for Bain, BCG, Oliver Wyman, any of these management consulting firms, there are dozens and dozens of them. If that's what you're coming to the US to do, that is not inherently a risky case. Now, of course, you would have to show you either have the degree or that you have 5 years of experience as a management consultant, but we wouldn't consider that a risky application because you're coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm. In contrast, the applications that are risky are where you're coming to the US as a management consultant to not work for a management consultant firm. So my example with the solar panels is a good one. You would be coming to give your services to that solar panel company, directly to the US employer. So your work is directly benefiting the US employer. At a management consulting firm, your work benefits that consulting firm's clients. So that's the less risky example. The more risky is where you're directly serving a US employer. So to overcome or kind of mitigate that risk, if you're coming to the US again to work for a company that is not a management consulting firm, there are a few things that we typically do in these applications to kind of mitigate or lower the risk of these. So, in general, what you want to think of is how can you make the TN application and your relationship with the US employer look as much like a management consultant agreement or relationship as possible. And of course, always you have to be honest. That being said, there are ways to speak with the US employer to structure the agreement so that it is consistent with what the government thinks a management consultant arrangement looks like. So how do you do that? The first thing that's important to do is go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook online, published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics by the US Department of Labor, and search for management consultant and look at those job duties that come up. The Occupational Outlook Handbook defines how the government thinks about specific occupations and the job duties that the government thinks certain occupations do. So step one is really making sure that what you're coming to the US to do for that US employer is consistent with what the government thinks a management consultant does. So look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook, make sure that your job duties are consistent with those listed in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. If they're not, then the government is going to say it doesn't look like you're actually coming to the US to work as a management consultant. So you want to make sure they are consistent. So think about other aspects of the relationship that can look more like a management consulting arrangement. A good example, management consultants are usually not full-time W-2 employees at the US employer, and they're usually not employed for more than a year, maybe 2 years. It's a temporary engagement because the US employer has a very specific problem and they need a management consultant to come in, address that problem, and then the engagement's over with. So some things to do. It is great if the management consultant is not a W-2 employee, rather is an independent contractor. An independent contractor who is compensated based on the deliverables. To go back to our example with the solar panels, maybe that management consultant in months 1 through 3 is going to observe the manufacturing process, is going to look at data, is going to analyze that data. In months 4 through 6 is going to compile that information into a presentation and present it to management. And in months 7 through 10, say, is going to work with management and actually observe the consequences of their recommendations and see if they're actually effective. And the management consultant will be compensated based on those deliverables. You see how that's very different from a salaried position. It's just like if you were hiring someone to advise you, there's specific things that you would want them to deliver. And you would pay them according to what they're providing to you rather than the number of hours they are working as an employee for you. So a management consultant is a similar arrangement where they're brought in for a very discrete challenge that they are uniquely equipped to address. And the application should make that very clear. Now, as Hugues said, a TN visa can be issued for up to 4 years. You can be granted 3 years of status in the US. When you're talking the management consulting category, though, it's oftentimes wise to reduce that period of time because, again, the TN employee, the TN management consultant, should only be in the US long enough to address a specific challenge. So a year is going to be best. 2 years is riskier, but if it's appropriate given the work that the person's doing, that can be fine. 3 years is long. It's long to employ a management consultant for 3 years. So you want to be ready to explain in the application why 3 years is necessary to address the specific challenge. And also you need to be ready at the interview at the border or at the consulate if you're applying in Mexico to explain why 3 years is necessary for this management consultant arrangement. So you see on your screen, the position must be supernumerary. What that means is, again, this is if you imagine a management consultant role, supernumerary just means it's a role that is in addition to permanent roles at the company. So a management consultant, most companies don't have a full-time management consultant position that needs to be filled, right? This is someone you bring in to address a specific challenge. And that's all that's saying. So that's the management consultant category. This is, I would say, the most challenging TN category. It is the one that, in general, more than any other, is worth working with an attorney on, just because it can be very complicated. So that being said, we have had great success with management consultant applications, both at management consulting firms and at companies that are not management consulting firms. So these applications can and do get approved regularly. You just have to navigate them very carefully and keep in mind what the government has in mind when it hears management consultant, and make sure that the employer in the US has that kind of an arrangement in mind. So economist is the second challenging category, but for completely different reasons from the management consulting category. The economist category is challenging because in 2017, the government put out a memo that basically said that those coming to the US as an economist on a TN visa need to very specifically be performing the job duties that economists perform according to the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So if you are at your computer, it is worthwhile to Google OOH economist. And when we do that, bring up that link for the OOH Occupational Outlook Handbook, and then click the link what they do, and you'll see there are 6 bullet points, and then there's an explanation about what economists do. And they do things like research economic issues, conduct surveys, collect data, analyze that data using mathematical models, statistical tools, and other software. They interpret and forecast trends. They advise businesses, governments, and individuals on problems of fiscal policy or other economic topics, and they present their research. So if you're coming to the US as an economist, you want to make sure that your job duties are aligned with that. They don't need to be identical to that, but the majority of your time does need to be spent doing those job duties. So what do economists not do? So that's what the memo in 2017 said. The government specifically excluded financial analysts and market research analysts from the economist category. So what the government was seeing was that many people who were coming to the US to work as financial analysts were applying under the economist category, and they were not doing these job duties. They were doing job duties of a financial analyst. And people were coming in as economists to do market research analysis. So the government wanted to put a stop to this. What do financial analysts and market research analysts do that economists are not supposed to do? So financial analysts, in summary, what they do is they would work for financial institutions to basically find opportunities to generate profits. So maybe they are looking at investment of stocks. Maybe they are advising on different alternative investments, ways to make money, ways for the employer to make money through investment. Market research analysts are basically looking for ways for their employer to improve their marketing. So both of those categories are excluded from the economist category. If you're coming to the US to do either of those things, then there are a few options. So the first is, if the minority of your job, of your time, the minority of your job duties is doing those things, you may still be approved as an economist if the majority of your time is spent doing the things that economists are supposed to do according to the OOH. So if 10% of your time is spent doing market research analysis, that may very well be approved if 90% of your time is doing what economists do according to the OOH. However, if the majority of your time is going to be spent doing financial analysis or market research analysis, you do have a risky TN case. One option may be to come in as a management consultant. You would make it clear that you are going to be assisting with these tasks. So again, you need to be honest in your application, but there could be an argument that your employer needs help with market research analysis. They're really struggling with that, and you're coming in as a management consultant to help them turn that around. Now, you would need to qualify based on the degree or the 5 years of experience as a management consultant, but that could be a viable path to do this work as a market research analyst, or potentially a financial analyst, although that is a harder sell. Again, that this is a risky path, but it is potentially a viable path depending on the specifics of the application. Finally, though, if your job duties just are not aligned with the economist job duties or the management consultant job duties, you may just need to look for a different visa. So H-1B could be an option, the O-1 could be an option, potentially an L1. So speak with a lawyer to figure out if there is another option that's better, if you just find that your job duties are not consistent with what the TN permits. We can go on, Hugues. All right, so Hugues already talked about this in excellent detail. And by the way, if you have any questions, feel free to send those in. We will have time at the end for questions. I'm actually not going to spend a ton of time on this because I think you did a great job. But in general, Canadians have all options available to them: consulate, port of entry, or USCIS if they're in the US. Nationals of Mexico cannot apply to port of entry, so they only have consulates and USCIS as options. And again, Hugues already went through all those options. USCIS is if you're already in the US. So if you're working for one TN employer and you want to continue working for that employer without leaving the US, you could ask USCIS for an extension of your status. If you're in the US with one TN employer and you get an offer from another TN employer, you could apply through USCIS to change your TN employer. You would need to wait until they approve before starting with the new employer, but that is an option. You can do concurrent TN employment. So it is possible to work for two TN employers at the same time, as long as the government has approved that arrangement, but that is something they do approve. And I'm referencing USCIS. You can also apply for these if you're Canadian at the port of entry. You can apply for two TN employers. If you're a national in Mexico, you can apply at a consulate for two TN employers. TN employment can be part-time, so you don't have to work full-time for a TN employer. And in fact, if you're working for more than one TN employer, you probably should not work for one of them full-time, because the government will ask logistically how you're going to make it work working for more than one employer full-time. So we can go ahead and move on. I think Hugues did an excellent job of explaining the logistics. A few tips. I think we touched on a few of these. We always recommend that you call ahead to the port of entry that you're planning to visit, especially if you're unfamiliar with the procedures. And really, you just want to ask what their hours of operation are, whether there are any specifics that you should be aware of being a TN applicant, if there's a specific entrance you should use, anything to be aware of. And this really became particularly relevant during COVID, when hours would change and there were limits on how many people could be in the waiting room. So anyway, it's always a good idea to call ahead. Your application packet is going to include a letter from the employer that details who you are, why you're qualified for the TN position, who the employer is, what your job duties will be, how much you'll be paid, the period of time you are going to work in the TN role. That letter needs to have an original signature if it's going to the port of entry or the consulate. USCIS does not require an original signature, but everyone else get an original signature. Similarly, get original documentation wherever possible. So passport absolutely has to be original always, but your diploma, have the actual diploma, not a copy of it. Your transcripts, make sure they're official copies. Again, any signatures. So for example, for the management consulting category, you prove your experience, your 5 years of experience, with letters from past employers. Those letters should have the original signatures on them, not a copy of a signature. The reason for this is that Customs and Border Protection encounters a lot of fraud. They're hypersensitive to it. So If they see copies of signatures, they immediately suspect this could be fraud. They may very well reject the application. So save yourself a trip and go ahead and get the original documents before you visit the port of entry or the consulate. I was saying before regarding the employer letter, which should have the original signature, should also have the contact information of the employer in the letterhead. List the phone number for the person who signs that employer letter. And the reason is that the CBP officer and sometimes the consular officer will actually just pick up the phone and call that person. Reason being just to make sure the job is legitimate, the job offer is legitimate. So give the employer a heads up, whoever you've been speaking with, to get the employer letter and whoever has signed it, and let them know you plan to approach the port of entry, tomorrow between 3 and 5 p.m., that they may get a call just to have their phone on them in case. And again, usually the questions are very basic. Like I have here a letter from the employer saying that you want to employ this person in this capacity. Is that accurate? And they would just say, yes, that's accurate. We do intend to do that, proving that the position is bona fide. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. It requires a showing of non-immigrant intent. What this means is that the TN visa is not a green card. So you do need to show that you intend to leave the US at the end of your status as in TN status. Now, what does that mean? We do recommend that you have with you copies of, say, bank statements from outside the U.S., showing that you have funds outside the U.S. If you have a mortgage, if you have an apartment, if you have family outside the U.S., it's good to bring proof that you have those ties outside the U.S. This usually is not an issue until you've renewed the TN a few times. So if it's your first or second time getting a TN, you will probably not be asked about your intent to leave. But if you're renewing for the third or fourth time, you may very well get questions about, do you actually intend to leave at the end of this? It's perfectly fine to renew the TN indefinitely. There is no limit to the number of times you can renew it as long as you remain eligible. Management consultant, as I mentioned before, it is risky to renew it multiple times for the same employer, but if you're going to different employers and providing your services, that can be perfectly fine. But anyway, have those documents showing non-immigrant intent with you. And if it comes up during the interview, it's always good to show those. If it doesn't come up, which it probably won't, then you don't have to bring the documents out. It's just good to come prepared. So we can move on. That was it. All right, perfect. Well, I think we addressed any questions. Hugues, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, and thank you to our participants. Keep an eye out for our email, which will have links to future webinars, a link to our YouTube channel, our blog, schedule a consultation if we can be of any assistance, and we hope to see you on future webinars.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.